Welcome to this presentation by ICP-TTA on responding to mass violence involving higher education institutions.
Hello, my name is Mike Mulhare. I'm the emergency manager for Virginia Tech. Been in that position about 13 years. I was brought on to Virginia Tech to establish the first office of emergency management. Prior to that, I spent 25 years working in emergency response in the state of Rhode Island.
My name is Gerard Lawson. I'm a professor in the counselor education program at Virginia Tech, and I've been actively involved in disaster mental health and disaster response since the early 2000s, including authoring the Virginia Tech behavioral mental health module of our emergency response plan. And I'm an active Red Cross volunteer providing disaster mental health services through the American Red Cross. We're very excited about the presentation that we have for you today. There's a number of pieces that are important to talking about the efforts on campuses and within campus communities that are relevant to the work that we do. This presentation will actually be broken into two modules. We've developed this so that the first module will focus on the dynamics and needs that emerge from domestic terrorism or mass violence events. The second part of this first module will focus on some of the immediate response needs from individuals and families that are impacted, as well as the campus and broader community needs. We'll then move into some of the intermediate and mid-range goals and needs for these same groups. And then finally, we'll present some of the longer-term considerations for supporting resilience and recovery in individuals and the communities that are involved. The second module of our presentation will include planning considerations and is designed to raise questions and issues to be considered when developing your plan. It also provides some approaches and practices, but it's recognized that within each higher education institution and jurisdiction, there are some unique characteristics and factors that a plan must be tailored to in order to meet those local needs. Following this presentation, it is our hope that participants will be able to identify the challenges and opportunities for planning for a mass violence incident that involves a higher education institution, be able to document the HEI capabilities and resources, and to coordinate with HEI partners to plan for, exercise, and assess their mass violence response.
While this project primarily speaks to criminal mass violence and domestic terrorism, the lessons and planning tools are applicable to other incidents that may result in mass casualties or when there is a need to provide assistance services to your community.
ICP-TTA has identified 16 best practices that are part of the plan development, and we will reference most of these 16 best practices woven throughout the presentation, as they are certainly applicable to communities that have a higher education institution in them and for individuals working within those institutions as well.
Different organizations define mass violence and domestic terrorism in different ways. Some use a number of fatalities, while others refer to the fact that the capacity to respond is overwhelmed. For the purposes of this presentation, as well as the ICP-TTA program, we're going to use the definitions listed on the screen. Mass violence is an intentional, violent act that causes harm to a large number of people, whereas domestic terrorism are activities that are also criminal acts that are intended to influence policy or government officials or coerce a civilian population. The FBI will be the lead law enforcement agency in the case of domestic terrorism and hate crimes, but will often provide support in the mass violence is considered a state crime. We will provide examples of these types of events as we get further into our presentation.
In this first section of the module, we'll talk about some of the predictable flow of what happens in a community following a mass violence event. In addition, we'll discuss the crisis impact model, some of the ways in which individuals and communities can experience a similar sort of event and come to very different sort of responses and recovery situations. We'll discuss some of the differences in types of higher education institutions. Those differences can be very important for helping a community to plan. And some of the on or off campus differences and similarities. What we find is that events in communities that have a higher education institution have a lot more similarities than they actually do differences. The first part of this is the crisis impact model. Before we get too much further into our discussion today, we want to talk very briefly about the models of crisis response for individuals and communities. This simple model shows that a crisis event that is experienced by multiple people will have a variety of reactions based on their perception of what the event was and the resources that they have on call to help to manage that event, in addition to their own experiences. These resources are both practical resources, things like insurance or financial resources, but are also internal resources. People who have had a past traumatic experience may not have the same resources to bring to bear, or they can't bounce back quite as quickly. Or because they've been through a traumatic experience previously, they may be able or be well positioned to be able to understand how they need to move through that crisis event more quickly. This may be the first time that we encounter the need also to address the variety of existing resources and perception of stressors for the community as well. For example, a community may have resources to bring to bear after a traumatic event that will help to ease the burden for individuals in that community. The perception of the event in the community level as well also includes how well prepared the community is to manage an event like this. The more competent responders will appear, the more likely it is for the community to be able to find a more positive outcome and for folks to be included in ultimately a more positive trajectory for their own and for the community's recovery. This is a timeline of what we often see following an emergency or a mass violence event in a community. Individuals and communities are going to experience this timeline differently. And what you'll notice is on the far left side is sort of the spectrum of emotional reactions, from more positive emotional reactions at the top end to more negative emotional reactions on the bottom end of the scale. One of the things that you can imagine is that if there is any sort of warning or threat prior to the event itself, you can begin to see a slight negative trajectory in how people are experiencing that, both individually and in the broader community. The first valley that we see, however, is when the actual impact of the event is felt, and it's the first low emotional challenge that follows for the individuals and for the community. But there's pretty quickly, following the impact of the event itself, this heroic phase. This is when there's a great deal of attention paid to first responders and others who've contributed in ways that help individuals and help the community to begin to recover. The people that have contributed at this point are singled out, their stories are told. There's a lot of coming together for the community. You'll see individuals in the broader community at this time reaching out and seeking opportunities to participate or contribute in a positive way. Think about people lining up for blood drives and people making voluntary contributions, financial and otherwise, to help a community to respond. The heroic phase peaks with what we would describe as a honeymoon period, where the community feels a connection with one another, and there's a common goal that is shared and sort of understood by both individuals in the community and the community more broadly. What follows is what we discuss as the disillusionment stage. As information comes to light, as those external resources that have been brought begin to step back, and as individuals try to reorient their life following a mass violence event, there is a reckoning with the true impact of what has transpired. You'll also note that at the bottom of this disillusionment stage, there's the potential for other events to trigger individuals and a community, because those events happen either in close geographic proximity or they share some of the similarities with a traumatic event from their community that's similar to what their own community experienced. The disillusionment stage gives way to the reconstruction. This reconstruction period can be thought of as the longer-term recovery process. There is nothing magic about that 1 year day of remembrance. The reconstruction and recovery can go on for months or years longer. Individuals and the community have worked through their grief and are beginning to come to terms with what is referred to as the new normal. That is a fairly typical timeline, and the process is one that we see very little variation from, regardless of the situation and regardless of the setting. There are some similarities and differences in the types of institutions that you may be working with as well. Many localities have a higher education institution in their community, but the size, the composition, the resources that institution can vary widely. Think about institutions where you work or a campus that is near your community. What is their campus type, and are there favorable or challenging conditions within their campus that should be there considered if there were a mass violence event in the community? Some of the typical ones that we consider are drawn out here on the slide as well. That are there residential students? A community college may not have students that live there full time, whereas a university may. Universities that are residential often have more comprehensive services available, mental health, medical services. Fewer of those services may be available in a community college setting. The integration within the community can vary widely as well, where individuals in the community college setting are often very well integrated in the community. Universities can be, but aren't always, somewhat insular in the way that they're viewed. And then finally, the geographic distribution of students. This can be a positive or a negative. Students may be very concentrated in a university setting because they live and go to school there, whereas a community college is more dispersed and has a more of a commuter student population. So when we think about the types of events that may need a response in terms of mass violence or domestic terrorism, there are a couple of possibilities that come to mind. Consider the possibility of a mass shooting that takes place in the community, but impacts a large number of students and faculty. A shooting at a nightclub or a concert venue that is frequented by students will draw in the higher education institution and their resources. Even though it happens in the community, concerned family members are more likely to reach out to the higher education institution rather than to the local authorities. As a result, the communication and partnerships that need to exist between the community and the institution become highlighted quickly and important to the ongoing process of response and recovery. Alternatively, there could be a domestic terrorism event and the possibility of a bombing on a campus sporting event or a presentation on campus by a controversial speaker. Any number of fatalities and injured will quickly surpass what the higher education institution can manage internally and will often require coordination with the broader community. Emergency services, hospitals, as well as community disaster or behavioral health resources will all need to be coordinated. And that partnership, again, between the higher education institution and the individuals in the community is going to be critically important. Regardless of where or how the event takes place, we need to consider the possibility that as the event is scaling up and we're bringing in resources from the community or even broader resources across the state, that there's also a need for to be aware of the additional legal requirements that exist at that local, state, and federal level. Although most people are familiar with the local laws and the state laws that are relevant to their emergency response plans, a large-scale event will also bring in very specific federal laws that need to be tended to in this sort of event. As we move into considering the immediate response phase, there are a number of pieces that we'll discuss. What are some of the issues that need to be managed during the incident itself and in the immediate aftermath? There's the completion of the rescue and also information and notification that occurs during this early stage of an event response. One of the most important first steps is to consider who is a victim. This determination is not going to be made by the higher education institution in most instances. Usually local law enforcement and consultation with the Attorney General or the Commonwealth's attorney will make a determination about who will be included in the protected class of victims following a large-scale event of mass violence or domestic terrorism. This determination is incredibly important because it will determine who has access to the Family Assistance Center moving forward, who has access to victim compensation, and who will be notified about legal proceedings as the event continues to move forward. This immediate stage of response also includes considerations that must be managed for the direct victims themselves, for the families of the victims, the wider campus community, and for the surrounding community. Using the example scenarios that we talked about earlier, you can imagine how these situations would be very different. For the directly impacted survivors, the physically injured or those that were not physically injured but were present, there may be individuals that need direct medical attention. They may need assistance with reunification with their support system, whether that's family or suite mates, friends and others in their community. There may be some individuals who are displaced or dislocated from their support system while they're awaiting shelter or transportation. Family members and loved ones are going to be reaching out quickly to try to ensure that their student is safe. They may call or travel to the campus while they're trying to get that information and ensure that their loved ones are safe. And they're going to have their own health, emotional, and spiritual needs that need to be tended to in the early stages of the disaster response. The wider campus community is going to have some specific needs as well. But there needs to be a broad acknowledgement of the event with information about what security measures are being taken and what services are going to be offered for the broader community. There's going to be outreach to the impacted units or departments on the campus that may be guided by their proximity to the event or the individuals that were involved in the mass violence. And they may need guidance about, and provide guidance about how to manage the intense media attention that also often follows an event of this nature. When we consider then the partnerships with our surrounding community, there are some similar sorts of concerns. As the event scales up, alerting community partners as early as possible about what needs will be managed and how to integrate their resources appropriately will help with the response and the recovery. Managing community participation can be both a good thing or present some challenges. This is where we're likely to see individuals who are deploying on their own, showing up to contribute resources or services without an invitation. It's also helpful to consider the needs for donation management. Cards, flowers, teddy bears, and even cash will begin to appear, and strategies for how to manage that are very important. We'll talk more about that in greater detail as we move forward.
The use of a call center. The scenarios presented earlier are complicated. Many jurisdictions and response agencies will be involved. There will be a need to provide accurate information through traditional communication channels, including social media. But there will also be a need to respond to the individual looking for information on a family member or needing additional assistance. A call center is needed to provide answers and to also gather information. If an HEI or an HE population is involved, many will look to that HEI for answers. The call center is a critical tool for providing information and creating a single point of contact, bridging the many response agencies that can provide specific information and services. A trained team is needed to manage and staff a call center, capable of providing answers, routing questions, collecting information, and as needed, provide psychological first aid. This may likely be beyond the capacity of an HEI and perhaps the local jurisdiction. You may want to consider developing relationships with other responsible partners or perhaps third-party providers to provide this necessary service. Think back to the examples of a shooting at a nightclub near campus or the attack at a sporting event. As previously mentioned, these type of incidents will create a lot of questions, concerns, and chaos for a number of people. Victims will be looking for their support systems. Parents and families will be traveling to campus looking for their students. Suite mates will wonder if their roommates were involved. Everyone will be looking for information on both the incident and their loved ones. The purpose of a reception center is to provide a common gathering place, information, and basic support services. The establishment of a reception center will likely be the responsibility of the higher education institution if something happens on the campus, in collaboration with the locality, and should be operational within 2 to 4 hours following an incident. A reception center is a short-term facility that is needed to provide just-in-time delivery of services, while more long-term response services are simultaneously being stood up. All functions should be provided in collaboration with community services. In fact, other entities in the community surrounding the HEI may also consider opening up reception sites, particularly as some services are mandated by law, and community service agencies will need a place for victims to access these services. In order to avoid duplication of efforts and confusion within the community, always ensure that community partners are involved in the planning process and consulted when a reception center is opening, especially for response to a criminal act. When individuals arrive to a reception center, they should encounter basic intake functions that serve as their initial point of contact with response staff. Basic information regarding who they are looking for, and whether they have spoken with law enforcement should be collected. This is where contact and next of kin information is gathered, as well as information about victims or missing loved ones. If witnesses or victims have not yet spoken with law enforcement, the reception center can provide a location for information relevant to an investigation to be shared by victims and witnesses, and for them to access basic information about what happened. Intake staff can share information regarding available services with those who arrive to the reception center. If an incident of mass violence or domestic terrorism, information is the most highly sought after resource. Information about what happened, the health and safety of individuals, location of loved ones, and the status of an investigation are all pieces of information that people will be looking for. As a result, information briefings are one of the most important functions offered at a reception center. Information briefings allow response staff to share timely, consistent, verified information with large groups of involved individuals at once. At the conclusion of a briefing, the timing of the next briefing should be shared so survivors and families know when to expect more information. A reception center is sometimes referred to as a reunification center. However, we believe language is important and the name can be misleading. While some family members may be reunited with loved ones at the reception center, others unfortunately may not. In the case that an individual dies as a result of mass violence incident, the reception center also serves as a location where death notifications may be conducted. In this instance, a separate confidential location within the facility should be used. Crisis support staff and spiritual care personnel should be present to support loved ones as they receive some of the most difficult information they will ever receive. Crisis support and spiritual care personnel also are present to support all who come to the reception center, not just those receiving death notifications. Individuals visiting the center may, understandably, be panicked and trying to make sense of the violence. Disaster mass violence trained mental health counselors and spiritual care staff can help provide stability and comfort. It may be necessary to deploy a core group of staff from the higher education institution to a reception center to provide basic support for some or all of these functions. However, a higher education institution should ensure that the deployed staff has the appropriate training or certifications for functions they are willing to fill. Fatality response. Fatality response is not necessarily the responsibility or will be the responsibility of the HEI. It's typically coordinated by the ME, coroner, or law enforcement agencies. HEI can support these notifications either through logistics or providing additional resources that may be of import to the family members related directly to the HEI. Security within a reception center is key. You want to provide a very safe environment for those who are using that facility. You want to ensure that those that do not need to be there, such as the media or others, are not within that area. Security personnel provide that secure environment, keep the media away, keep curiosity seekers away, establish protocols for use of the space, arrange opportunities for victims to recover personal effects, or again, to provide a reunification in a very safe and controlled environment. One of the other things that's very important for those responsible for security of space is, as other agencies come to the response, to make sure that they're appropriately credentialed, and those that need to be there are there, and those that do not need to be there are sent to other parts of the operation responding to the incident. One of the things that needs to be considered early on is volunteer and donation management. It happens much more quickly than you would expect. Individuals will be looking to volunteer to assist, and donations, both monetary and tangible goods, will be sent to the incident site. You need an organized structure to manage these. A volunteer and donations management plan provides this. You can find a full training on developing a volunteer and donations management plan on the ICP TTA website. But the general steps you need to take following an incident are: assess your needs. What services and supplies do the victims and families need? What do you need to best serve them? Then you will want to coordinate with external agencies. Many nonprofit organizations, like the American Red Cross and other BOADs, voluntary organizations active in a disaster, have experience with donation management. In particular, the National Compassion Fund has significant experience with financial donations and management. They may be able to manage this aspect of your response for you. Understand what internal and regulatory restrictions may be in place on monetary donations made directly to the higher education institution. Additionally, external agencies assisting with the response may have insight into needed goods and services based on what they're seeing amidst their response efforts. You will need a location where donations can be sent, stored, and sorted. Without a set location, people will likely bring donations to the incident site, which will interfere with the response and investigation efforts. You want to keep as many unnecessary people away from the incident site as possible to allow responders to do their jobs more easily and protect the privacy of victims and their families. Having a separate donation site helps with this. Once the logistics of the donation management center have been established, this information should be shared with the public. What type of donations are you accepting? Where should donations be dropped off? What are the hours of the donation center? Where should monetary donations be sent? What will the donations be used for? The donation location will also need to be staffed so donations can be received in an orderly fashion as possible. Staff will be able to organize and catalog donations. You need to know what you have, how much you have, and where it can be found within the center. This allows you to communicate easily with the incident command staff and deploy resources to where they are most needed and appropriate. Additionally, those making donations may want documentation of their donations for tax and other purposes. Staff at the donation center can manage this process. You will also likely need to provide a report of donations you received following an incident. Finally, donations can be distributed according to your needs and for the purposes previously communicated to the public. Plans should also be developed to appropriately dispose of unneeded or inappropriate items. You'll be surprised what donations can come in. Standing up a volunteer intake center can be very helpful. Registration, check-in, and just-in-time training for volunteers. Expect the arrival of many unsolicited volunteers. In short, volunteer and donation management allows you to accept and manage solicited and unsolicited volunteers and donated resources, like facilities, services, and goods. They will come whether you're ready for them or not, so it's important you plan prior to an incident. Financial donations will also likely flow in. Early and consistent messaging around where to make donations and what the funds will be used for is essential to an organized accounting and distribution of funds to victims and agencies.
The intermediate response section really deals with the 2 to 3 days after the incident until the first day of remembrance or thereabouts. During this period, a family assistance center may continue to exist and function, and there may be opportunities to see portions of or completion of the prosecution of a perpetrator if one survived the mass violence event. Using the same sort of categories of participants, you can see how there's an evolution of some of the services and information that needs to be provided across these different areas. Direct victims may need social services support and benefit support as they continue to move forward in their own recovery. This is an area where victim compensation becomes incredibly important. Understanding what other services and financial resources may be available to victims following a mass violence event. We'll talk in more detail about that moving forward. Many direct victims are going to have medical expenses associated with their own recovery, and there may be legal support required, including individuals who want to be part of the ongoing court proceedings to be able to provide victim impact statements or other services that may be related to the legal system. Behavioral health support, ongoing mental health counseling and behavioral health supports are going to be necessary, and spiritual care may be necessary in this period as well. As you can imagine, for some families, the evolution is also going to be reckoning with the need for burial costs. They may have their own behavioral health service needs, mental health counseling, and disaster-related counseling that'll be provided in the community. Spiritual care, again, along with families that have been impacted, is an incredibly important aspect of this. For the wider campus community, there's a beginning shift away from some of the immediate response, but we'll also begin to start thinking about memorials and the ways in which people are going to want to memorialize the people who are impacted, both the victims that died and those that survived. The wider campus community may have their own behavioral health needs, spiritual care needs, and we may want to begin thinking about and preparing for that disillusionment stage with the wider campus community and the surrounding community. Those needs are very similar in the broader community as well. The memorials, the behavioral health needs, and preparing for that disillusionment stage of the response timeline. Reactions to disasters bring up a number of different challenges. Identifying populations that have been impacted, especially the vulnerable populations, is one of the key strategies for being sure that we're providing the services in the right place in a timely manner. Vulnerable populations are those subsets of the population that may suffer greater harm or a lengthened recovery process. There's a number of ways to think about these vulnerabilities, and one of them is the age of the impacted subgroup. Older and younger populations tend to have a greater need in terms of guidance and support as they're reacting to trauma or a mass violence event. There are a number of cultural connections that may be relevant in terms of the services that we're going to be provided. If there's a cultural connection that the targeted group or the perpetrator was a member of a specific cultural community, that may be an issue that needs additional support and create some additional vulnerability for people that are members of that community. We need to consider pre-existing physical and mental vulnerabilities. Individuals that have pre-existing conditions are at increased risk for additional trauma-related challenges, and reaching out to secure some supports for those individuals as the situation is developing will shorten that recovery process for them. Similarly, we need to be concerned about individuals who don't speak English as a native language, or those that may not be in our specific outreach avenues in a normal course of events. Initial information may not reach these groups effectively. We also need to think about how that language barrier is going to impact the service provision across the board. Similarly, there are burial requirements that can vary widely based upon religious or cultural traditions. We need to tend to those concerns for individuals that may have been more directly involved. Individuals of more modest socioeconomic status may not have access to mental health services or may not have as readily available the resources that they need to make a referral to mental health counseling. Even individuals who may have those services may have difficult time taking off work to tend to their trauma-related needs. We'll talk in greater detail how to help to support some of those concerns. There are concerns that need to be tended to for the country of origin as well. Some family members who are not U.S. citizens or aren't living in the United States may not have the resources necessary to come to your campus community to participate in some of the events described. Similarly, there may be language barriers or assistance that is going to be required for individuals traveling to your community from other countries. And there are populations within the community that may need additional outreach attention because they're not plugged into the same avenues for resources and outreach that we would normally use. The Family Assistance Center is one of the mechanisms that we can use in this intermediate response stage as well. This will allow individuals who have been identified as part of the victim group and their loved ones to come together and congregate, seek information, and obtain some of the enhanced support services that are necessary for those that are more directly involved. The Family Assistance Center typically functions for a longer period of time, and the location and privacy of this center is very important. There continue to be needs similar to the reception center earlier that we described earlier in terms of security and support, but this is separate from the broader community support services and designed specifically for those that have been most directly impacted by the event. The Family Assistance Center provides a number of disaster-related services to meet the needs of victims and their families. It'll provide advocacy and support for victims of the crime. External agencies that are going to be part of this ongoing response should be contacted immediately to be able to deploy individuals that are going to be part of this process using a transparent and seamless process so that survivors and victims don't need to look out further, that the resources will come to them rather than them having to move out and look for them. The family care and case management component of this is incredibly important. We want to provide service coordination for victims and their family and loved ones. And although this is a time-limited process that involves partnerships between the liaisons and the victim families, there's a great deal of work that needs to be done and can bring all of the families together to do this in a similar sort of way. Family Assistance Center will provide personal care support and referral resources, identifying resources to meet the immediate basic needs and the longer-term support for victims and their families and loved ones. It'll help to coordinate with social service agencies and nonprofit organizations and other resources, as well as coordinating with advocacy agencies. Some trauma and crisis counseling and spiritual care often occurs in the Family Assistance Center as well. This provides on-site access to mental health professionals for the victims and their families and loved ones, and allows them an opportunity to get those services where they are rather than having to make referrals out into the community. Family Assistance Centers are often the mechanism used as well to arrange site visits where families and loved ones seeking closure or answers will coordinate with law enforcement to visit the site of the trauma, the emergency, so that they can see firsthand how their loved one was impacted. Trauma counseling and spiritual care support personnel should always be available for site visits as well to provide support to the families and loved ones. I want to talk for a few minutes about the Victims of Crime Act and the victim assistance and compensation that can be included in that. The Victims of Crime Act was originally passed in the mid-'80s and directs that money collected from federal prosecutions be deposited into the Crime Victims Fund and then distributed to states to be used to support victims of crime in a variety of ways. At the state level, there's a VOCA administrator, either an agency or individual or both, that is responsible for supporting victims of crime and complying with the federal guidelines. Some of the services that are available include responding to the emotional and physical needs of crime victims, assisting primary and secondary victims of crime to stabilize their lives after a victimization, assisting victims to understand and participate in the criminal justice system, and providing victims of crime with a measure of safety and security, such as boarding up broken windows or replacing or repairing locks. Victim compensation will follow an individual for the rest of their life as long as they stay under the state cap for funding. And there is an extra pot of potential funding available for survivors of mass violence and domestic terrorism. Many of these services go well beyond what a higher education institution can provide. So it's important to include VOCA representatives in the planning and response efforts to ensure that victims and families receive the support that they deserve. There's also some campus community supports that can be brought together at the same time. As the response continues, outreach to individuals and groups that were affected by the violence are important. Even individuals who were not initially identified as victims may have a reaction to the violence that interferes with their day-to-day life and can be successfully mitigated. Typically, the services that are provided happen through a combination of education and outreach and psychological first aid, which helps to connect individuals with ongoing support systems. It's important to consider which groups have been affected directly or indirectly by the violence to assess their ongoing needs. For example, a sorority or fraternity that lost several members would benefit from periodic education about the normal course of trauma experiences, as well as directed opportunities to provide referrals for ongoing behavioral health. Similarly, there may be people who were impacted significantly but are not part of an organized group to receive these sorts of outreach efforts. Community canvassing and wellness screening events can help to identify individuals who may otherwise not receive the support that they may need. Behavioral health services can be provided to the campus community through a number of means. The Campus Counseling Center, Women's Center, International Student Center, any of the existing personnel at these regular locations can continue to work with individuals who have been impacted by the violence. The institution may set up satellite offices designed specifically to be closer to areas or individuals that were impacted by the violence, but may be time limited. These are opportunities to do direct outreach to individuals who may need those services, but are not going to go to the existing services on their own accord. Call centers can be set up and is specifically helpful to provide consistent information about the violence event and the response and recovery, as well as providing referral information for individuals. Employees assistance programs can be useful to help to provide ongoing counseling services to employees who were impacted by the violence. Be mindful of the possibility that not all staff may have access to EAP benefits. Often these benefits are bundled with health insurance coverage, which means that wage employees or those who opt out of insurance coverage because a spouse or partner carries their plan may not be eligible for EAP services. Again, it's important to have a conversation with the Employee Assistance Benefits Coordinator to understand what services can be provided following mass violence and what those eligibility requirements are. Finally, there may be additional resources brought specifically as a response to the mass violence event or to supplement the services that are being provided on campus. Coordination with local mental health agencies is critical to ensure that no duplication of services and that there are as few gaps as possible in the community services that are being provided. That brings us to the long-term response. When we're talking about the long-term response, we're usually looking at the 18 months plus. This will see us through the completion of the prosecution of any surviving perpetrators. Appeals, parole hearings, penalty imposition, and sentencing will all be handled in the long-term response section. There may be the memorial dedications and ongoing anniversaries or days of remembrance, and we may see a shift to a community resiliency center. Using our same 4 areas of focus, direct victims may need additional support around the day of remembrance. We may need to pay specific attention to their evolving needs. What concerns or questions do they have as things continue to develop for them? And individuals should be on the lookout for triggering events that happen around the country that, again, may bring up issues that they thought they had resolved or things that they continue to work on in their own mental health recovery. Physically injured or not physically injured, those that were temporarily displaced or dislocated are beginning to move back into their day-to-day life and find new ways that the violence may have had an impact. So the ongoing response is going to be helping them to identify those needs and move through them in a positive way. Families, additionally, are going to need support around the day of remembrance. We may need to also pay attention to the evolving needs of the family members that have been impacted. Same for the wider campus community, seeing how the day of remembrance is going to become part of the community recovery process and whether or not there needs to be attention to graduation or other notable events in the higher education calendar. The wider campus community is also engaged in the process of reclaiming their identity and moving away from being defined by this violent event, trying to get back to the business of teaching and learning. And the broader surrounding community may be engaged in an after-action review, looking for ongoing support in the development and maintenance of those critical partnerships. Some of the long-term considerations that go along with this stage have to do with referrals, ongoing needs, and some of the technical or logistical concerns. Bear in mind that the individual reaction to a trauma event is not a steady or linear process of either improvement or challenges. Some individuals who were directly impacted by the violence may choose not to participate in any support services initially, but after years, find that they continue to have difficulty in their life that seems related to their experiences of the mass violence event. Similarly, individuals who have participated in services and recovered to a fairly stable or even improved level of functioning may find that a mass violent event brings up new challenges or concerns for them that will require some additional supportive resources. For the broader campus community, there may be ongoing needs related to safety and security or memorializing the victims. These needs may go on indefinitely, with annual days of remembrance and acknowledgement of the event in local or national media. And there are practical decisions that need to be made about when to stand down or re-engage call centers, information for the broader community when there's a community-related event that needs to be publicized. In an instance where the perpetrator survived the mass violence event, care must be taken to communicate with the community around the time of the trial, and in particular near the announcement of the verdict and or sentencing. The demobilization of the efforts for recovery can be as important as how it is stood up in the first place. Demobilization can be phased by scaling back services that are no longer needed. Some of these decisions are easier than others. Even though every effort is made to identify and respectfully handle the remains of those that have been killed, there may need to be a decision made about when that's no longer practical to search for missing individuals. Some demobilization can be guided by the number of individuals that continue to seek services. Although this seems fairly straightforward, making a decision about when to stand down a family assistance center in advance of the emergency can be especially useful. Often communities may find a very small number of families still utilizing the services, but their needs remain fairly profound. It's tempting to continue FAC services in this situation, although those family needs may be better met or met more efficiently through liaisons or service navigators. Part of what may drive this decision is also the need to gather family members for in-person briefings on a regular basis. As that need wanes, it's less likely that a formal FAC model continues to be necessary. Similar decisions need to be made about services that are offered in the broader community and across the campus, including the outreach and psychological first aid services that have been described previously. As the number of community members who are seeking those sorts of services declines, it may be appropriate to reorganize how those services are provided and centralize those services into a resiliency center. Even resiliency centers should not be an open-ended community presence. At some point, the expectation should be that individuals can find resources within the community as opposed to using the Resilience Center as the one-stop clearinghouse. Resource lists and activities may exist through electronic communication and media for the foreseeable future so that individuals with emerging needs are able to find the support that they need, even after the Resiliency Center stands down.